When Martin Velasco, heir to one of Argentina's largest fortunes with a net worth of $200 million, got the call telling him his father had suffered a heart attack right in the middle of a humble Buenos Aires neighborhood, he never imagined that a young stranger had saved his life. Camilla Soria, 26, a nurse at a public hospital earning just enough to cover rent, had performed CPR for 15 minutes straight until the ambulance arrived. She didn't ask for anything in return, not even leaving her name. She simply vanished into the crowd like an anonymous angel. What neither of them knew was that fate would bring them together again, and that night in an emergency room would spark a love story that defied class differences, social prejudice, and proved that sometimes heroes don't wear capes. They wear hospital scrubs and have hearts bigger than any bank account. It was a sweltering afternoon on March 15 in Buenos Aires, one of those late fall days when the heat refuses to leave the city. The streets of Bodo buzzed with life. Street vendors selling empanadas, kids playing soccer on the sidewalks, neighbors sipping mate on their front steps. It was a world far removed from the skyscrapers of Puerto Madero and the mansions of San Isidro, a place where people worked hard and knew each other by name. Camilla Soria was walking down Castro Barros Street after finishing a 12-hour shift at Hospital Peña. She was exhausted to her core, her feet throbbing in her white nursing shoes, and all she wanted was to get to her tiny 2-room apartment, take a cold shower, and sleep until the next day. At 26, she had blonde hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and honey-colored eyes that showed a mix of fatigue and determination. Her light blue uniform was wrinkled from the long hours, but she wore it with the pride of someone who knew her work mattered. She'd studied nursing at a public university, working night shifts at a corner store to pay her way. Her mother, a widow since Camilla was 15, had juggled finances, so her only daughter could have a career. Now Camilla paid it forward, sending money every month to Rosario, where her mom lived in a modest little house filled with flowers and memories. That's when she saw him, an older man, maybe 70, dressed in clothes that clearly didn't belong in this neighborhood. A perfectly tailored gray suit that stood out against the locals' jeans and t-shirts. He was standing on the corner, looking confused at his phone, when suddenly he clutched his chest. His face twisted in pain and his knees buckled. Camilla ran before her brain even caught up. Her legs moved on instinct. From years of training, from that drive that separates those who act from those who just watch. She reached him just as his body hit the hot pavement and knelt beside him in seconds, fingers checking for a pulse in his neck. No pulse, he wasn't breathing. Without hesitation, she started chest compressions, counting out loud like she'd been taught. 30 compressions, 2 breaths. 30 compressions, 2 breaths. A crowd gathered, some filming on their phones, others yelling for someone to call an ambulance. Camilla blocked out the noise and focused on what mattered, keeping the stranger alive. The minutes dragged like hours. Sweat poured down her forehead and soaked her back. Her arms burned from the effort, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Every compression was a fight against death. Every rescue breath was a plea to the universe to give this man another chance. When she finally heard the ambulance sirens approaching, 15 minutes had passed. 15 minutes of superhuman effort that left her muscles shaking and her heart racing. The paramedics rushed in with the defibrillator, and Camilla stepped back, quickly explaining what she'd done, the timing, the maneuvers. The first shock didn't work, neither did the second. Camilla closed her eyes, praying to a god she wasn't sure she believed in. On the third shock, the monitor showed a heartbeat, weak and irregular, but there. The man was alive. The paramedics loaded him into the ambulance with practiced efficiency. One of them asked Camilla her name for the report. She hesitated for a moment, then just said she was a nurse and had done what anyone would do. Before they could press her, she slipped into the crowd of onlookers and disappeared down the streets of Bodo like she'd never been there. She didn't want recognition or to end up in the news. She just wanted to get home, shower, and process what had happened. She'd saved a life. That was reward enough. What Camilla didn't know is that the man she'd pulled back from death was Eduardo Velasco, founder of one of Argentina's most powerful business empires, and that his son Martin would move heaven and earth to find her. Martin Velasco was in a board meeting when he got the call. His assistant interrupted the presentation, pale-faced, whispering that it was urgent. Martin stepped out of the room with his heart in his throat, phone to his ear, hearing the words no child wants to hear. Massive heart attack, CPR on the street, critical condition, top tier hospital. He raced to the Otamendi clinic, blowing through red lights and speed limits. His father was in intensive care, hooked up to machines beeping steadily. The doctors said it was a miracle. If not for the person who'd performed CPR for 15 minutes, Eduardo Velasco would be dead. The paramedics only knew it was a blonde nurse who'd refused to give her name and vanished before they could thank her. For the 3 days his father spent in EQ, Martin thought of nothing else but finding her. He hired private investigators, reviewed security footage from nearby stores, and talked to every neighbor in the area. Bit by bit, pieces came together. A young woman in a light blue uniform, blonde ponytail, light eyes, who worked at a public hospital. It wasn't until Eduardo woke up and could speak that Martin got the key clue. His father vaguely remembered honey-colored eyes, a voice telling him to hang on. Help was coming. He remembered the smell of hospital disinfectant and firm hands pressing on his chest. Martin was 32 and had inherited his father's pragmatism along with his fortune. Tall, dark-haired with a neatly trimmed beard, he had blue eyes that could be ice cold or warm as the sea depending on the moment. He wore custom suits, drove a black Porsche, and lived in a Palermo penthouse overlooking the river. He'd dated women from his social circle, models and heiresses who knew the rules, but no relationship had lasted more than a year. None of that mattered now. The only thing that did was finding the woman who'd given him back his father. A week after the heart attack, he finally had a name, Camila Soria, nurse at Hospital Peña. She lived in Bodo, in an old building on Columbus Street. She was 26, single, and by all accounts, the most generous, hardworking person anyone knew. Martin decided to find her himself. No assistant, no messenger. This was too important. He spotted her leaving the hospital after another grueling shift. She was walking with her head down, checking her phone, not noticing the luxury car parked on the corner. Martin got out and approached her, his heart beating faster than he'd expected. When she looked up, there was no recognition. To her, he was just a suited guy blocking her path home. He introduced himself, explained who he was and who his father was. He saw her eyes widen in surprise as it clicked, her cheeks flushing as she realized why he was there. He thanked her, told her his father would be dead without her. He offered a reward, any amount she wanted, an apartment, a car, whatever she needed. Camilla looked at him for a long moment, then did something Martin didn't expect. She turned it all down. She said she hadn't done anything extraordinary. Any nurse would have done the same. She didn't want money for saving a life. That was her job, her calling. Martin pushed, but she stood firm. Finally, he asked for at least a proper thank you. Dinner, coffee, something. She hesitated, and in that pause, he saw a crack in her armor. She agreed to coffee, just coffee. Neither of them knew that coffee would be the first of many, and that in a little Bodo cafe, something neither had planned would begin. Coffee turned into dinner. Dinner turned into walks around the city. Walks turned into conversations that lasted until dawn. In just weeks, Martin and Camilla had built a connection that defied logic. He took her to exclusive restaurants, but she preferred neighborhood pizza places. He showed her his world of galas and high society events, but she felt more at home with her coworkers. They were different in almost everything. He'd grown up in abundance. She'd grown up scraping by. He'd studied at private universities abroad. She'd gone to public ones in Argentina. He measured success in numbers and deals. She measured it in lives saved and smiles restored. But when they were together, none of that mattered. Martin discovered in Camilla an authenticity he'd never found in his circle. She didn't treat him differently because of his money, didn't laugh at jokes that weren't funny, didn't fake interest in things that bored her. She was real in a way that completely disarmed him. Camilla, for her part, saw that behind the expensive suit and famous last name was a genuinely good man. Martin visited his father daily during rehab, donated millions to charities without fanfare, treated his employees with respect, and looked at her like she was the most fascinating person in the world. It all changed one night in Camilla's apartment. eating takeout and donatas while watching an old movie on her small TV. Martin looked at her with crumbs in his beard and sauce on his $1,000 shirt and said he hadn't been this happy in a long time. Camilla felt her heart skip, and when he cupped her face with a tenderness that took her breath away, she knew she was done for. The kiss started soft, almost a question, then became the answer neither had known they were seeking. But happiness has enemies, and Martin Velasco's world was full of them. His mother, Graciela, was a society woman who judged people by their family tree and bank balance. When she learned her son was dating a public hospital nurse, her reaction was explosive. She arranged a family dinner and introduced Martin to Valentina Arauz, an heiress, blonde, elegant, and perfect by her class standards. Camilla found out through a gossip magazine that ran photos of the dinner, speculating about an engagement. The pain hit her hard, a stab of jealousy and shame that made her question everything. She didn't belong in that world. She never would. When Martin called to explain, she didn't pick up. When he showed up at the hospital, she refused to see him. She needed space, time to think. What Camilla didn't know was that Martin had publicly turned down Valentina that same night, causing a family scandal that still echoed in high society circles. She didn't know he'd argued with his mother to the point of tears, defending a woman who had no idea what was happening. And she didn't know Martin was willing to lose everything for her. The weeks that followed were the hardest for both. Camilla buried herself in work, taking double and triple shifts to avoid thinking. Her coworkers noticed the dark circles under her eyes, the long silences, the way she stared at her phone, waiting for something that never came. Martin dealt with the fallout of his choices. His mother stopped speaking to him. His younger sister called him a family traitor. In business circles, rumors flew about the Velasco heir who'd lost his mind over some nobody from the barrio. But it was Eduardo, recovering slowly at his San Isidro home, who put things in perspective. He called Martin into his study, the same room where he'd taught him to read balance sheets and negotiate deals, and asked something unexpected. Did he love the woman who'd saved his life? Martin answered without hesitation. Yes, more than anyone ever. Eduardo smiled, eyes filling with tears, and told a story Martin had never heard. When he was young, before building his empire, Eduardo had fallen in love with a small-town girl, a rural teacher with nothing but kindness and courage. His family opposed it fiercely, and at 22 scared he'd given in. He married Graciela, a woman from his class, and built the life everyone expected. But he'd never been truly happy. Now, 60 years later, he begged his son not to make the same mistake. Choose love over expectations. Be the brave man he never was. That night, Martin drove through a torrential April downpour to Bodo. He climbed 5 flights to Camilla's apartment. The elevator was broken. He knocked, soaked to the bone, heart on his sleeve. When Camilla opened the door and saw him dripping wet and shivering, something inside her broke. All the walls she'd built, all the reasons this could never work. They crumbled at the sight of this man who'd crossed the city in a storm just to stand at her door. He didn't speak at first, just looked at her with those blue eyes now shining with desperation. When he finally did, his words were simple but full of truth. He said he didn't care what his family thought, didn't care about the scandal or rumors. If she'd have him, he'd give it all up, sell the companies, donate the money, live in her 2-room apartment eating corner store empanadas for the rest of their lives, because nothing he had was worth anything without her. Camilla cried, from relief, from joy, from all the pain she'd held in those weeks. "Sie Then she kissed him right there in the doorway, water pooling at their feet, while the neighbor down the hall clapped from her apartment. She didn't need him to give up anything. She just needed to know he would. The months that followed were about building a solid relationship, bridging 2 seemingly incompatible worlds, redefining what it meant to belong. Camilla formally met Eduardo, who greeted her with tears and a hug that lasted over a minute. He thanked her not just for saving his life, but for saving his son from an empty existence. From then on, Eduardo became her biggest champion, standing up to Graciela every time she made a snide remark. Graciela didn't give in easily. She staged family interventions, hired investigators to dig up dirt on Camilla's past, even tried to pay her off to leave Martin. Camilla endured every attack with a dignity that eventually started to crack even her mother-in-law's resistance. When Graciela learned Camilla had turned down a $500,000 check without hesitation, something shifted in how she saw her. Martin learned to value the simple things. He'd bring Camilla coffee and sandwiches during her night shifts, met her extraordinary coworkers who worked miracles with limited resources, and started investing in public hospitals, not for PR, but because he'd seen the reality up close. Camilla adapted too. She navigated Martin's world without losing herself, attending charity galas in borrowed dresses at first, then bought ones, but always with the same authenticity. His friends, initially skeptical, grew to admire her lack of pretense. On a trip to Rosario to meet Camilla's mother, Martin knew for sure he wanted to marry her. The house was small, filled with plants and family photos, smelling of fresh fried dough. Camilla's mom, Rosa, welcomed him with a hug and mate, treating him exactly like the corner grocer. No bowing, no nerves, just the warmth of a good woman. Martin proposed that night in the backyard under a starry sky you can't see in Buenos Aires. No ring, the decision was spontaneous, impulsive, perfect. Camilla said yes through laughter and tears. Rosa cried so much they had to bring her water. The ring came later, a simple but perfect diamond from a neighborhood jeweler, because Martin knew Camilla would prefer that over anything flashy from Ricolta. And he was right. The engagement news divided Buenos Aires' high society. Some cheered the romantic story. Others whispered that the nurse had snagged the millionaire. Martin and Camilla cared less and less what people said. They'd built something real in a world of appearances, and that was worth more than any opinion. The wedding came a year after the day Camilla saved Eduardo's life. It defied every high society convention. They married in the Bodo church where Camilla was baptized, a modest but historic place. The reception was at a neighborhood club with grilled meat, empanadas, and a cake from the best local baker. Guests ranged from millionaire executives to public hospital nurses, from Camilla's mom to international diplomats. Graciela attended, not joyfully yet, but with an acceptance that was a start. Eduardo was his son's best man, walking with a cane but standing tall, proud of the family his son had chosen. Camilla walked down the aisle on her mother's arm in a simple but beautiful dress from a regular bridal shop on Avenida 11. She didn't need famous designers or sewn-in diamonds. Her beauty came from within, from the peace she radiated, from knowing she was exactly where she belonged. Martin waited with wet eyes and an uncontainable smile. When she reached him and took his hands, he whispered something only she heard. That he loved her, always would, and thanked that heart attack every day for bringing them together. They wrote their own vows. Martin promised never to take for granted the life she'd helped him value, never to forget where she came from, even though he came from somewhere else, and never to let the outside world taint what they'd built. Camilla promised to love him not for what he had, but for who he was, to remind him of his humanity when power threatened to corrupt, to be his anchor in the storms ahead, and above all, to always stay the girl from Bodo who saved a stranger because it was the right thing to do. They danced their first dance to a Fido Pease song about love in Buenos Aires. Guests cried and laughed. When the night ended, Martin and Camilla left in a yellow taxi instead of the limo he'd booked because she wanted to feel the city one more time before their honeymoon. 3 years later, Eduardo Velasco passed peacefully in his bed, surrounded by family. In his will, he left a substantial fortune to public health foundations in honor of the woman who'd given him more time with his son. The foundation bears Camilla's name, though she protested for months before accepting. Martin took over the family empire but transformed it. The Velasco companies became known for ethical practices, social responsibility programs, and community commitment. Graciela eventually softened, especially after the birth of her first grandchild, a baby with his mother's honey eyes and his father's determination. Never quit nursing. She cut her hours, yes, but kept working at the public hospital where she'd started. Her coworkers treated her the same as always, teasing her when she appeared in magazines and asking her to bring pastries for birthdays. It was their way of keeping her grounded, and she was deeply grateful. When people asked the secret to their marriage, Martin and Camilla would look at each other and smile. No secret, they'd say, just the daily choice to choose each other, to value what they had, to remember that true love doesn't care about class or bank accounts. Wettens, because in the end, what brought them together wasn't money or fate. It was one selfless act of kindness on a Bodo street. A woman who saved a life expecting nothing in return, and a man brave enough to cross every divide to find her. And so, in a city of contrasts where the rich and poor lives separated by invisible walls, Martin Velasco and Camila Soria proved that the greatest love stories start with the simplest gestures, that real heroes don't seek recognition, and that sometimes, just sometimes, the most beautiful romances begin with a heart that stops beating and another that refuses to give up.